Preparing the mold for rock castings. I'm using a Woodland Scenics mold, or actually two of them. Firstly, you spray it with some wet water, that is water with a bit of a dishwashing liquid or detergent in it. And it doesn't have to be soaking wet, just nice and damp. And here's the second one. So being sprayed. And then we place that on a nice level area. I have leveled out that specific area on my workbench. And the next step is to mix the plaster. I am using a chicken liver tub, which is disposable, to mix the plaster. I have added 1.5 measures of water and 3 measures of plaster of Paris. So that gives me a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 plaster and 1 water. Mix it until there is no more lumps visible. It should be a nice liquid, almost like a cake batter. I'm using an old credit card that I cut up to give me a nice spatula shape, or a flat area to mix the plaster with. Keep mixing till there's very little air bubbles. You can see the air bubbles tend to rise to the surface. Also make sure to scrape the corners, that there's no plaster sticking in the corners. And now let's begin pouring. And the second mold. See if we can scrape all the plaster out of the container. And sometimes it is good to give the mold a tap on the side, just to have the plaster sink in and fill all the crevices. See if we can do that with this one. Okay, then we leave them to dry. Releasing the casting from the rock mold. That is quite simple. You gently peel the silicone rubber casting around the edges all the way, and then the casting will just pop out, or should just pop out, like this one is doing. There's a bit sticking, but there we are, a beautiful rock casting. Let's try the other one. Whoops, that went a bit quick, but there is the other casting. And now comes the fun part, and that is painting them. I will demonstrate 2 different techniques, one with acrylics and one with oil paint. This time we're going to use oil paints. I have got a whole set of oil paints. We will only use a few of those colors, and then we will use mineral turpentine instead of water, the same brushes and the casting that we have made. Let us start by giving this rock its base coat, which is going to be a grayish coat. With the oil colors, very little paint is used, so I have basically put just about a capful from the tube, and I will thin it down with some turpentine and then apply it to the rock casting. The turpentine I just pour into the cap of the bottle, and I then normally just wet my brush in the turpentine and touch it to the paint, and then let's start applying it over the rock casting. Seems like we might need a bit more paint. And it would be advisable to wear a mask while using the turpentine and this paint, as the turpentine fumes are quite noxious. Continuing with the grey on the casting, this time you can see I've got a bit more turpentine on my brush and the paint flows a lot easier. You can see that already starting to look very good with just the first coat of oil paint on it. But of course the rocks are not only one color, and in some cases I've actually seen some almost orange bits and pieces on rocks, so I'm going to add a very small dab of orange to represent a bit of rust. Okay, there we are. And one thing that I have forgotten that we use with this as well is toothpicks. And you will now see why. The oil paint is extremely potent, so we pick a little bit up with the toothpick and we place it where we would want the rust to be quite pronounced, and then we wet a small brush in the turpentine and we touch it. And you see it's starting to flow. Just see if I can get a bit more of the paint. It does seems that was the first bit and not very well mixed. Touching it with a bit of paint on the brush, and where else shall there be a bit of rust peering through, and there goes my battery. We're going to continue, hopefully the battery will last, with a bit of burnt sienna, using the same technique of just placing a little bit on the rock, using a toothpick, and then we take a brush dipped in turpentine, touch it, touch it, touch it, and you see how it just flows. And then the last thing I would want to show, and that is how to do the wash with the black to get the crevices highlighted. So we're highlighting the lowlights by adding a black wash. I'm going to just take the black out of the container, put a dab of black in the little mixing tray, what do you call, palette, and then take my brush, wet it very well in the turpentine, thin the black down very well, and run it where I see there's deep crevices. Just run this all across. And again, it's starting to look yucky, but this is not the end result yet. Now we take a large brush again, dip it in the turpentine, which is almost dried up, and we run it across. And you see how it spreads, blending with the other colors. And very subtly you can see the yellow sticking out on this end and the red on that side, but the overall is the black wash. And you can thin it down even more with a bit more turpentine, which I will do because this looks a bit too dark to my liking. And it's amazing, you can see the difference it makes just thinning it down. With some turpentine on the brush. And that also brings out the white of the plaster for the highlights. I think that rock looks very nice if you want to have a rock with that specific color. And then of course the beauty of this technique is, remember the one that we did with the acrylic colors, you can actually blend the two once the acrylic has dried by using a bit of the oil paint, running that across the acrylic colors. And it will not attack the acrylic once it has dried. So you can darken this one slightly or add some rust or highlights to it with the oil paint and the pinprick technique with a pinprick of paint, and then adding some turpentine to actually make it flow. Sorry, I see I've taken thinners, but that seemed to work as well, but turpentine works much better. We're going to use a small pinprick of yellow on the rock that we have used the oil paints on, and then we will take a little dab of turpentine if the brush does not have black on it. Let's see, there's another clean brush. Just dab it. Come, let's try a bit more, and let's get a bit of, let's say, a red or burnt sienna to make a bit of a rusty rock lower down in this casting. Again, just a pinprick or a toothpick prick of color, of oil paint. And then dip it into the turpentine, touch it to the casting, and see how that actually just flows, and we can just blend it a bit more. Just need a bit more red there to And there is the other rock casting, done with oil paints, and of course you can add a few more highlights in different colors and also dry brush it with white. Let's try a little bit of white oil paint on a dry brushing, but my camera's battery is running very low. Dry brushing with white, I have extremely little paint on the brush, and then I still wipe most of it off, and you just touch, 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 and touch where you want the highlights. And there is the finished product. One other thing that I want to mention, if these two will be added next to each other, which they won't because of the vast color difference, but to make sure that the rock strata, which on this castings are both running horizontal, is always in the same direction, because it's going to look very odd if this casting is that way with the strata running vertical and this one is horizontal. But if you put the two together, both running vertical, that looks good, or both running horizontal, or even that one that way around, that looks quite good when both the strata are running in the same direction.